What if the world's most fearless leader wasn't sitting in the halls of the United Nations, but walking through the dust of Ouagadougou? What if the most disruptive force in modern global politics was a young captain from Burkina Faso? In a world dominated by Western headlines, few names break through from the African continent. But one has. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and in just 2 years, he has gone from being a military officer to a revolutionary symbol, not just in Africa, but globally. He's not just confronting insurgency, he's confronting the very narrative the world has long held about African leadership, African dignity, and African destiny. But why now? Why does a name from Burkina Faso, a country so often overlooked on the international map, suddenly echo in protests in New York, hashtags in Brazil, and student murals in South Africa? Is Africa News finally writing its own script, or is someone tearing the old one apart? This isn't just about politics. This is about power, narrative, and who gets to decide what liberation looks like in the 21st century. So, let me ask you, what does real leadership look like in your eyes? Is it found in polished suits, or in people willing to risk everything for sovereignty? Let's dive in. When Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in 2022, the world didn't pay much attention. He wasn't elected through a flashy campaign. He didn't come bearing a Harvard degree. He came in military fatigues, unpolished, unapologetic, and completely uninterested in Western approval. To many in Burkina Faso, he was simply what the moment demanded: a soldier who refused to let foreign boots trample on national pride, a patriot who would rather build schools than wait for handouts. In his words, "We are not here to beg for survival. We are here to reclaim our dignity." And dignity, it turns out, travels. Within months, Traoré's policies, from expelling French troops to promoting local food sovereignty, weren't just covered by Africa News. They were translated into street chants in Oakland, into protest signs in Paris, into murals in Detroit. Why? Because his leadership doesn't just speak to Africans. It speaks to anyone who's tired of being managed, manipulated, or muted. And that message cuts across borders. In America, where political figures often rely on PR machines and corporate donors, Traoré stood out as a reminder that clarity and courage still matter. In a world of likes, he didn't care to be liked, he cared to be effective. And people noticed. He may lead Burkina Faso, but somehow, he's making millions rethink who they follow, and why. Do you think courage can be more contagious than charisma? What would it take for your leaders to earn your respect? Not just your vote. It started with a TikTok. A 15-second clip of Ibrahim Traoré, standing in full military gear, calmly declaring, "We are not here to beg for survival. We are here to reclaim our dignity." That sentence detonated across the internet. On Africa News, it was just another press clip. But on Instagram, it became a digital anthem. In Oakland, it was printed on protest posters. In Harlem, his face appeared on murals once reserved for Malcolm X and Fred Hampton. No marketing campaign, no global media tour, just a raw image of leadership in action. And a world hungry to see it. Burkina Faso was no longer just a name on a map. It was a question mark burned into the conscience of a generation. If this small West African country could reclaim control, dignity, and direction, why couldn't we? Artists began designing stencils of Traoré's face. High schoolers quoted him in classroom debates. Even rap lyrics sampled his speeches, turning his military defiance into cultural rebellion. The message was simple but radical: real leadership doesn't need validation. It needs vision. And that vision, coming from a country so often dismissed by the West, hit a nerve. What happens when a leader doesn't wait to be accepted by the world, but reshapes it instead? By the time Traoré's face appeared on a Harlem mural beside Frederick Douglass, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just a name anymore. He had become a mirror, and what Americans saw in that reflection was uncomfortable. Burkina Faso, a country once viewed by Western analysts as poor, unstable, and forgettable, was suddenly being held up as an example of what real sovereignty could look like. Traoré had expelled French military forces. He rejected IMF loans. He refused to be treated like a charity case, and yet, he didn't collapse. Instead, Africa News began reporting surprising updates. Burkina Faso was producing electric buses without foreign funding. Local agriculture was reviving. Youth confidence in national institutions was rising. Compare that to what's happening in Baltimore, St. Louis, or Flint, where corruption eats infrastructure, where schools are underfunded, where hope is outsourced to elections that feel more like coin tosses. Suddenly, a question echoed through protest lines: if Burkina Faso can build for itself. What exactly is America's excuse? It wasn't just activists asking. Educators, city planners, even progressive politicians began quietly studying Traoré's strategies. Could local food co-ops follow Burkina Faso's model of decentralization? Could city councils rethink public transport using examples from West Africa? Even some members of Congress, when confronted by protesters holding "Hands off Africa" signs, had no answers, because the question wasn't just about Africa. It was about America's hypocrisy. Africa News wasn't just informing anymore, it was challenging. So what happens when the example is no longer the West, but the South? Are we willing to learn from those we once tried to teach? As the protests grew louder, the questions got sharper, and in a surprising turn, action began to replace outrage. Inspired by Ibrahim Traoré's policies, several grassroots groups across the United States started experimenting with localized, community-first strategies. Not slogans, not symbolism. Structures. In Chicago's South Side, a cooperative launched a pilot urban farm modeled after Burkina Faso's food independence strategy, prioritizing heirloom seeds, rainwater systems, and community labor. In Brooklyn, a Pan-African cultural center canceled its usual film festival lineup and replaced it with a new series titled Africa Rising from Sankara to Traoré. The goal? Not just admiration, education, replication. In Atlanta, educators rewrote their February curriculum. Instead of another round of lessons about slavery and the civil rights movement, they introduced a new unit: Modern African Governance, the Case of Burkina Faso. Africa News even featured segments showcasing these American projects inspired by African leadership. Reversing the usual narrative where Africa copies the West. In Minneapolis, a local candidate for city council ran with a radical message. We don't need Wall Street. We need what Traoré has: food, energy, land. Suddenly, African governance was no longer foreign. It was practical, strategic, necessary. What's remarkable isn't just the political ripple. It's the cultural humility. For decades, America exported democracy like a brand. Now, it was importing courage from a nation it once overlooked. What if the answers to our broken systems aren't over there, but down there? Could Burkina Faso, through the example of Ibrahim Traoré, become not a student of democracy, but a teacher? What began as political admiration quickly turned into something deeper, a cultural awakening. For generations, African Americans were told, explicitly or subtly, that Africa was a place of poverty, chaos, and despair. Schoolbooks rarely taught about modern African governance. Hollywood rarely showed strong African leadership, and news coverage. It focused more on coups than courage. But Ibrahim Traoré changed that. Young, principled, and proudly unapologetic, he became a symbol of something many African Americans hadn't seen before: a black leader who leads with power, not permission. Across the U.S., identity centers began rewriting how they taught African history. From Detroit to D.C., libraries added biographies of Traoré and Thomas Sankara. In Philadelphia, high schoolers painted murals of Burkina Faso alongside Malcolm X. In Los Angeles, spoken-word poets performed verses titled Traoré's Echo, comparing his clarity to the confusion in U.S. politics. Even Africa News began publishing op-eds reflecting on this phenomenon. What happens when the African diaspora no longer sees Africa as distant, but as destiny? From hashtags like Reclaim Africa to workshops titled Children of Sankara, the cultural current was clear. Traoré had sparked something ancestral. He was no longer just a president. He was a channel, connecting continents through resistance, not nostalgia. What if Africa isn't just where people come from, but where ideas can come from too? Can identity be rebuilt not by remembering trauma, but by recognizing strength? When Ibrahim Traoré first appeared in U.S. headlines, many politicians didn't even pronounce his name correctly. They didn't plan to talk about Burkina Faso. They certainly didn't want to explain why Americans were chanting the name of an African military leader in protests across New York, Chicago, and Oakland. But silence was no longer an option. Protesters began flooding Capitol Hill. Petitions were sent to Congress asking why 25 African countries, including Burkina Faso, were listed in new U.S. visa bans. Traoré's name was on posters next to phrases like, "Why punish those who fight for independence? Africa doesn't need saving. It needs space." Africa News ran op-eds with biting questions. If a sanctioned African nation can protect its people, why can't the richest country in the world? Even centrist Democrats found themselves cornered. when confronted with images of Traoré building schools and kicking out foreign troops, while U.S. cities closed libraries and expanded prisons, the comparisons were brutal. This wasn't admiration anymore. It was exposure. The myth of Western superiority was cracking. Washington wasn't prepared. Think tanks scrambled to produce white papers on ideological contagion. Policy briefings now included risk assessments for African leaders becoming icons of U.S. activism. And what scared them wasn't violence. It was vision. Burkina Faso had become more than a country. It was now a measure. And Traoré, a mirror the West didn't want to look into. Can a young African soldier change the political narrative of a superpower? Or better yet, what does it say about the superpower when he already has? Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask to become a global icon. He didn't hire PR teams. He didn't tweet into trends. He simply led, with courage, clarity, and conviction. And in doing so, he showed us something rare, that true leadership doesn't wait for permission. It takes root in communities. It grows from struggle. And sometimes, it speaks louder from the margins than from the center. Today, when protesters in America hold signs with Burkina Faso on them, they're not just showing solidarity. They're asking a bigger question. What kind of world do we want to build? Or one that recycles broken systems? Or one that dares to imagine something different? Africa News was once reporting on Africa from afar. Now it's being shared in US classrooms, quoted in city halls, and reshaping how the diaspora sees itself. This isn't just a story about Africa. It's a challenge to every nation to remember that power without principle is nothing. And that sometimes the boldest visions come from the most overlooked places. So here's the question we leave you with. What would it look like to bring Traoré's spirit, not his uniform, but his mindset, into your city, into your school, into your vote? And if Burkina Faso, under sanctions and pressure, can still dare to lead, what's stopping the rest of us?